We're back on Inside USA talking to former Ambassador John Bolton. Thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here.
I want to keep talking about this concept of regime change because you're one of the few people that speaks publicly about it in American foreign policy circles these days. In an interview with Foreign Policy magazine last year, you said, "Once upon a time, we knew how to do clandestine regime change. We need to reacquire that capability." I guess you're talking about CIA-backed coups of the past decades.
And supporting pro-democratic, pro-freedom forces within a variety of countries around the world. Absolutely.
So do you think CIA-backed coups are a good way of advancing America's interest in the world?
I think sometimes they are necessary ways to advance American interest. I don't necessarily see it as the preferred way, but I think the U.S. should have that capability.
Where would you use it today, and how would you do it?
Well, I think there are two places in particular where the regimes do pose threats to the United States and its friends and allies. One is in Iran, the other is in North Korea. I think there are significant reasons to believe that both regimes are highly unpopular and much more fragile than people think.
So we've seen this movie before in Iran. The CIA's first coup was in 1953 against Mossadegh over the issue of nationalizing oil. It brought in the Shah of Iran. I don't suppose that's his record is one that you're particularly proud of.
Well, I think in terms of modernizing Iran, if you took a vote among the Iranian people today compared to the 15th century clerics they have running the country today, you might see a majority for the Shah.
So then do you think that the Soviets helped to modernize Afghanistan, bringing suffrage to women and other rights?
I don't think that's what they were in Afghanistan for.
But in terms of modernizing the country, I mean, if you're looking to regimes and invasions
But if asked the question, I favor equal rights for women. I don't think that's necessarily an argument for regime change. But I do think there are situations where there's no alternative in order to avoid a much less acceptable option, for example, an Iran with nuclear weapons.
But by overthrowing a popular and democratic movement in Iran in 1953, the United States helped to usher in an era which was a police state, which was a terrifying state in many ways, despite modernizations, which itself gave way to the Islamic Revolution in 1979.
I think that's a very oversimplified view of history, because it was to prevent, again, something even worse, which was a possible communist takeover. Now, you can say...
Which was a democratic election, in theory, and a secular movement.
17 years later, that consequences flowed from that were undesirable, but a decision maker has to make decisions as of the time and circumstances that he or she is presented with. And I tell you this, I wouldn't apologize for that coup.
So fundamentally, what is the argument for anti-democratically advancing regime change in other countries? I mean, the United States...
Which democracy are we talking about? North Korea, Iran?
Well, Iran in 1953 was a democracy. You would never apologize for a coup against a secular democratic revolution in that country. So I'm not sure.
You can get to a point of receiving a plurality or a majority at the ballot box and still be a threat to democracy. Adolf Hitler was. Communist-led movements in Iran and other places were as well. You can argue about that or not, but in the context of the time and in the circumstances, I still think it was the right thing to do.
But in an election year, when Americans, whether or not they...
I'm not running for anything.
I understand that.
I just say what I think.
It is a moment when Americans are looking around at the world, and the world is looking at the United States. And the United States is a deeply unpopular country, to the extent that it rarely has been in the past. Not exclusively, but rarely. And Americans there's a lot of enthusiasm in this country for the guy who stands in Berlin and says, I want to be a cooperative part of the world community again, whether or not that's just political messaging. You seem to feel that this is all sort of sad.
Well, I think that none of those people vote in the American elections. And right now, the polls still show a very close election, despite the adulation of 200,000 screaming Germans. I'm not sure if I were advising a candidate, I'd go to Berlin and speak to that kind of crowd, but that's his choice.
But you haven't addressed the point, which is that Americans seem a little weary of being the global bad guy.
You, like many of the Europeans, have already held the election. It's possible Senator Obama will win. It's possible he won't win
Forget the
either.
election. How about the American electorate? the actual people who say in overwhelming numbers, over 75%, that the country is headed in the wrong direction, partly because they're tired of being the global bad guy.
Well, I think that weighs on their minds maybe 0.1%. I think they're more worried about the economy. And I think that's obviously one of the reasons they think the country is going in the wrong direction and why Bush's popularity levels are so low.
Do you think that American lives are worth more than other lives?
I think the President of the United States has an obligation to the American people. I don't think he has an obligation to anybody else. And in that capacity, he has to make some very hard decisions. And American presidents over the years have made very hard decisions, like Truman's decision to drop nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, you can argue about the relative value of people's lives. I think all human life is precious and equal. But an American president follows American interest. And
damn the torpedoes.
And I think a Prime Minister of Denmark has the same obligation. A Prime Minister of India has the same obligation. I think that's true for any national leader.
So
and anybody,
this is a vision of the world in which countries are in a sort of Darwinian competition, and that the role of cooperation, international cooperation, is sort of naive, right?
Name one country, in one case, where the leader has said to his constituents, I actually value the lives of our adversaries equal to or more than ours. Just name me one right now. Go ahead.
Well, it's in the constitutions of many countries and in the Charter of the United Nations, and it's in the basic principle of humanitarianism.
Who has followed it? Name one. Name, in particular, name a Democratic politician that's followed that.
So the argument is because principles are difficult to achieve, we should abandon them.
That's not the point at all. The point is, in democracies, the elected officials are responsible to their own citizens and consider their interest to be paramount. That's the theory of democracy. A president, an elected official, represents the people who elected him. He doesn't represent somebody else. Now, if you have a problem with that, by all means, let me know.
So you reject the idea that because the United States is the world's only superpower, the most powerful economy, and that has been premised on extracting resources, labor, and other benefits from the rest of the world in a relatively unequal equation in some ways.
Well, that's a very Marxist approach. I think it's contrary to history. I think the fact is that that every other country pursues policies that are in their self-interest. I think they all do that. I don't know. I'm not aware of any country that follows policies that are demonstrably not in their self-interest, proclaimed to their citizens that are not in their self-interest. The U.S. is the only one that gets criticized for it. That's part of being, as you say, the world's only superpower.
It sure is.
But it's not a reason to behave any differently.
We're running a little short on time, so I want to ask you something that I've been wanting to ask you for a while. Have you seen this? It's the charge against you for participating in a common plan to initiate a war of aggression, i.e. the invasion of Iraq. It was prepared by the English writer George Monbiot, who tried to make a citizen's arrest when you were at a literary festival in England last spring.
Yeah.
Have you looked at the details?
Oh, yeah.
And what is your response? The main charge is that in your role as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control, that you oversaw the creation of that infamous fact sheet that was circulated at the UN that contained the completely fraudulent allegation that Iraq had bought uranium from Niger.
This thing is complete nonsense from top to bottom.
So you didn't oversee the creation of that fact sheet?
You know, it was one of many fact sheets prepared that mentioned Niger uranium. I never saw it. The staffer of mine who did prepare it said, basically, this office can't comment on the substance of this.
So the chronology that the State Department released to Henry Waxman, which describes a meeting on December 18th, 2002 between you and Colin Powell and the public affairs official Richard Boucher, specifically asked for your help in developing a response to Iraq that could be used for the press, and that you agreed to task the Bureau of Non-Proliferation, which was under your direct responsibility, with creating this fact sheet. There's a record of the emails going back and forth to you with this fact sheet in multiple versions, all have this fraudulent allegation of Niger uranium in them. You're saying
I'm saying it was a purely bureaucratic function. The allegation had been repeated across the government many years. I had personally, and my bureaucracy had no way of knowing whether it was factual or not.
Despite the fact that the CIA and the State Department had already said that that information was not reliable.
The British intelligence service still believes in it. This is a true nit that fruitcakes have picked for a long time, and I'm sorry to see you picking it now.
Well, I'm interested in your complete denial, because this fact sheet was one of the key. I mean, it's still a stain on the United States record. I mean, Colin Powell can't be proud of his presentation to the United Nations.
I think it was a completely insignificant point that was designed simply to show inadequacies in Saddam Hussein's false declaration of his weapons of mass destruction program. It was cleared throughout the bureaucracy at a bureaucratic level.
The fact that there was just a transparent lie about uranium from Niger that was used by the president himself in justifying the march to war.
And the people who looked at the information had no reason, low-level bureaucrats had no reason to know whether it was true or not true.
So when do you say is the first time you heard of this claim?
About Niger uranium?
Yeah.
I think when I heard it in the President's State of the Union
message. So none of those emails that have been documented by the State Department is going into your inbox wherever you just missed them, because it wasn't that important at the time.
Yeah, it was not that important to me at the time.
The fact sheet that was used by the United States at the United Nations to refute Iraq's claims was not that important at the time?
It was used by the press office at the State Department. I didn't pay any attention to it. And my office, the one staffer in my office who looked at it said, you really need to have another bureau take a look at this.
I have to ask you a final question. Do you think the world is a safer place after 8 years of the Bush administration?
I think it's safer in some respects and less safe than in others, but I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that the overthrow of Saddam Hussein was the correct decision.
Thank you for nitpicking with me.
Okay, happy to do it.
Okay, all right, let's take a seat.